The wind in Wyoming territory did not whisper. It screamed. It was a razor, honed on 1,000 miles of frozen plain, and it came for Silas Vane with a personal fury. He leaned into it, his shoulders bunched, the brim of his hat pulled so low it was a shelf for the accumulating sleet. It was late afternoon, but the storm had stolen the sun, leaving the world a smear of churning gray and white. He was checking his northern fence line, the one that abutted the vast, hungry spread of Luther Maddox. The wire was down in 3 places, snapped not by cattle, but by the sheer, brutal force of the gale. Everything out here, Silas thought, was a battle against erosion. The wind, the snow, the drought, or men like Maddox, all of a piece, all designed to wear a man down to nothing. He was half a mile from his cabin, heading toward the relative shelter of the creek bed, when his horse, a stoic gray gelding named Jed, threw its head and shied. The horse snorted, a plume of steam ripped from its nostrils, and it sidestepped the path. "Easy, boy," Silas murmured, his voice lost to the wind. He squinted into the white. He was used to the tricks of the light. A tumbleweed could look like a bear, a shadow like a wolf, but this was different. Down by the creek, tangled in the brittle, ice-caked willows, was a mound of darkness. It was the wrong shape for a rock and too small for a lost calf. He dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the new snow. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard, a precaution born of habit rather than immediate fear. He walked 10 paces, then stopped. His blood ran cold, colder than the wind could make it. It was a person, a woman. She was face down, one arm flung out, her dark hair frozen in icy tendrils to the ground. She was wearing a dress of thin wool, a foolish town thing that offered no protection. It was torn at the shoulder, revealing skin that was a mottled, waxy blue. Her boots, he saw, were ruined. The leather was split and the sole on one was gone, leaving only the soaked stocking beneath. Silas knelt, the rifle now forgotten. He touched her neck, his gloved fingers fumbling for a pulse. Nothing. He ripped his glove off, pressing his bare, calloused thumb against the artery. He waited. 1 second. 2. A faint, thready flutter, a hummingbird's wing against a gale. He turned her over. Her face was a ruin of bruises. A dark, ugly purple stain bloomed high on her cheekbone, swelling her eye shut. Her lips were cracked and blue. She was unconscious, or perhaps just too far gone to wake. He did not waste time considering the morality of it. He did not wonder who she was or what she was doing on his land. She was alive, and the storm was not finished. He shoved his rifle back into the scabbard, bent, and slid one arm under her knees, the other behind her back. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of sticks and wet wool. He mounted Jed in a single desperate movement, settling her across his lap. She did not stir. He wrapped the edges of his own oilcloth slicker around her as best he could and turned the horse toward home, praying the cabin was not as far as it suddenly felt. He kicked the cabin door open with his boot, the wind shoving him from behind. He carried her straight to the hearth and laid her on the bare rug before the cold fireplace. He did not put her on his bed. That felt like a violation, an intimacy she had not agreed to. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency. First, fire. He stacked the kindling and logs he kept dry in the box, and soon the hearth was blazing, casting a dancing, unsteady light on her still form. Next, the wet clothes. They were frozen to her. He took his hunting knife and carefully cut the laces of her remaining boot, peeling it and the stocking from her foot. Her skin was dead white, frighteningly cold. He cut the dress up the seam, his movements precise, impersonal. He was a rancher, accustomed to saving newborn calves, and he treated her with the same urgent, detached care. When the dress was gone, he saw the rest. The bruise on her face was not the only one. Her ribs were a tapestry of old and new injuries, yellows and purples overlapping, a raw, red burn, like a rope had been pulled tight, circled one wrist. This was not a woman who had been in an accident. This was a woman who had fled a war. He covered her with his thickest wool blanket, then went to the stove. He pumped water into the kettle and set it to boil. He found a clean rag and the small tin of salve he used for rope burns and cracked skin. He sat on the floor beside her and began the slow work of bringing her back. He dipped the rag in the warm water and gently washed the grime from her face, revealing the true shape of her jaw, the delicate arch of her brows. He put salve on her cut lip, on the raw skin of her wrist. She moaned once, a sound so low it was barely human, and tried to curl away from his touch. "You're safe," he said, though the words felt hollow. He did not know if they were true. He forced spoonfuls of warm broth, thin and salty, between her lips when she drifted near consciousness. For 2 days, she did not truly wake. She existed in a fever dream, crying out at shadows, her hands clutching the blanket. Silas sat in the chair opposite the hearth, cleaning his rifle, oiling his tack, reading the same pages of a week-old newspaper. He slept in that chair, his ears tuned to her breathing. She woke on the 3rd morning. The storm had passed, leaving the world in a state of blinding, silent white. He was standing by the window, looking out at the endless snow. When he heard her stir, he turned. She was sitting up, the blanket clutched to her chest. Her one good eye was wide, taking in the small, rough-hewn cabin, the shelves of tins, the hanging saddle, and finally, him. She was a cornered animal, a coyote in a trap. "Where am I?" Her voice was a dry rasp. "My cabin," Silas said. He did not move, afraid any sudden motion would send her bolting. "You were in the storm, near the creek." She processed this. Her hand went to the bruise on her face, wincing as her fingers brushed the swollen skin. "You brought me here." "I did." She looked down at the blanket, at the man's shirt he had put on her after cleaning her. Her fear was so palpable, it was a smell in the room, sharp and metallic. "My name," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "is Lorna." She stopped. The silence that followed was heavy. She was offering a name, but holding the rest back, a shield. "Silas Vane," he replied. Tears welled in her one good eye, spilling over. "I was in an accident. A wagon. It overturned." Her gaze darted to the floor. "I got lost. I walked for a long time." Silas looked at her. He saw the lie, clear as day. A wagon accident did not leave rope burns. It did not put that kind of terror in a woman's eyes. But he also saw the desperation, the plea for him to accept the story she offered. She was not strong enough yet for the truth. He nodded. "Once. This is a hard place to be lost." He gestured to the pot on the stove. "There's more broth. You should eat." She looked at him, surprised by the simple acceptance. I can't pay you. I have nothing." "I didn't ask for pay." "I need time," she said, the words rushing out. "Just a few days, to get my strength. Then I'll be gone. I won't be a trouble to you." Silas considered her. She was fragile, yes, but he had seen her fight for breath by his fire. There was a core of something hard in her. He was a man who lived alone, and he understood the value of solitude. But he was not a man who could turn a half-dead woman back into a blizzard. "You're not trouble to me," he said. It was the truest thing he had said in days. "You can stay. Eat the broth, Lorna." He turned back to the window, giving her the privacy of his back. He heard her settle back into the blankets, and a moment later, the quiet, broken sound of her weeping. The day settled into a strange, shared rhythm. The landscape outside was an enemy, a vast and frozen prison. The mornings were a shock of frost, coating the inside of the single-pane window so thick it looked like carved marble. At night, the coyotes howled, their voices thin and hungry, sounding closer than they were. The wind never stopped. It ripped at the shingles, found every crack in the chinking, and made the cabin feel as small and fragile as a ship in a storm. They were 2 people in a tiny box, surrounded by 100 miles of white death. The isolation was absolute. It forced a kind of intimacy that conversation never could. Lorna moved from the hearth to the small, curtained-off alcove that held his spare cot. She was a ghost in his home, silent and watchful. He noticed how she flinched. A log dropping in the fire made her jump so hard she nearly dropped the cup in her hands. When he came in from the barn, he learned to stomp the snow off his boots loudly, to make noise, so his sudden appearance in the doorway did not make her gasp. She did not sleep at night. He would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning and see her. She would be standing by the window, just a shadow against the pale moonlight on the snow, staring out. He would ask her if she was all right. She would just nod, her back to him, and eventually drift back to her cot. He stopped asking. He simply accepted it, the way he accepted the wind. After a week, she stopped being just a patient. She began to move, to reclaim her own body. He came in from checking his traps, frozen to the bone, and the cabin smelled different. It smelled of baking. She had found his meager stores of flour and lard and had made biscuits. They were heavy, more like rocks than bread. But they were hot, and she had made them. She set a plate of them on the table with a tin of molasses. "It's not much," she whispered. She still rarely spoke above a whisper. "It's good," he said, and he ate 3 of them, the heavy dough settling in his stomach like a warm stone. The next day, she found his mending kit. When he came in for supper, his coat, which had been missing a button for 6 months, was hanging by the door. The button was sewn on tight, the stitches small and perfect, though he knew her hands still trembled. She began to cook. He was used to jerky and beans, a diet of function. She found the dried apples and salt pork, the potatoes in the root cellar bin. She made stews. She swept the hearth. She washed his dishes and her own. They rarely spoke. He would be cleaning his rifle at the table. She would be peeling potatoes. The only sounds would be the scrape of her knife and the metallic click-clack of the oiled rifle parts. But the silence was no longer empty. It was full. It was a shared quiet, a routine that felt more like a home than his cabin had in 5 years. He found himself watching her. Her bruises faded from purple to a sick, sallow yellow, then disappeared. The fear in her eyes, however, stayed. It was a permanent stain. She was peeling potatoes one evening, the knife moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. The light from the lantern caught the scar on her wrist. He was sitting across from her, oiling a bridle, the leather smelling sharp and clean. A log in the fireplace popped loudly, a sharp crack like a gunshot. Lorna cried out. The knife and the potato clattered to the floor. She was on her feet, her back pressed against the wall, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was not for him, but for a memory. Silas froze. "Lorna!" She did not hear him. Her gaze was distant, fixed on something he could not see. She was standing in a grand dining room, the table so long she felt miles from her husband. Luther Maddox sat at the other end, his suit perfect, his hair slicked. Guests were there. He was smiling, charming them, a pillar of the community. But his eyes, when they met hers, were flat, cold, like chips of blue ice. He had raised his wine glass. "To my lovely wife," he'd said, his voice booming. "A woman who knows her place." The guests had laughed, thinking it a loving joke. Lorna had only smiled, her face a frozen mask, while his boot pressed down on her foot under the table, grinding the bones, a silent, vicious punishment for a perceived slight earlier that day, a threat behind a smile. "Lorna," Silas said again, his voice firmer this time. She blinked. The grand dining room dissolved. She was back in the small cabin, the smell of leather and wood smoke. Silas was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Just a log," he said. She nodded, trembling. She bent to pick up the knife, her movements jerky. "I'm sorry, I'm clumsy." He did not call her on the lie. He just went back to oiling the bridle. But later that night, when the cabin door slammed shut in a gust of wind as he came in, he saw her flinch again. She was standing at the stove, her back to him, but he saw her shoulders hunch, her spine go rigid. A different memory. The door slamming. Luther, his face flushed with whiskey. "Where have you been? Who did you talk to in town?" His shadow falling over her as he advanced, the smell of liquor on his breath. "You are my wife. You are my property. Do you understand me?" The back of his hand, swift and hard. She gripped the edge of the stove, her knuckles white. Silas closed the door again, this time gently, letting the latch click softly into place. He said nothing. He simply took off his coat and hung it on the peg. He was learning her language. It was a language of flinches, of silences, of sudden, sharp terrors. The thaw came 2 weeks after her arrival. It came suddenly, the snow melting in rivers, turning the hard ground into a sucking mire. The world outside was still dangerous, but it was no longer frozen. Lorna had begun following him to the barn. She said she needed the air. He knew it was because the cabin felt too small, too much like a trap. He was in the barn, checking the hoof of his mare. Clementine! The barn was cool and dark, smelling of hay and horsehide. It was a quiet, peaceful place. Lorna stood by the open door, watching the light slant across the dusty floor. He watched her, his work forgotten for a moment. She was still thin, the oversized shirt he had given her hanging from her shoulders. But her hair was brushed, tied back with a bit of twine. Her skin, pale from her time inside, had a faint touch of life. She was looking at the horse, a small, sad smile on her lips. In that moment, she was not a victim. She was not a refugee. She was just a woman, standing in the sunlight. He sensed it then, the thing he had mistaken for fragility. It was not fragility at all. It was a fire, banked low, smothered under ash and fear, but still glowing. A person did not survive what she had survived without a core of iron. She turned, perhaps sensing his gaze. She took a step toward the mare, her foot catching on an uneven floorboard. She stumbled, a small gasp leaving her lips. Silas moved without thinking. He reached out, not to grab her, but to steady her. His hand closed around her wrist. He froze. She froze. It was the wrist with the scar, the one he had salved. His thumb rested directly over the faded, puckered rope burn. It was not a medical touch. It was not a practical, life-saving gesture. It was the first time he had touched her as a man, and not a savior. He could feel her pulse, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, beating against his skin. He expected her to pull away. He expected the fear, the flinch, the retreat into herself. Lorna did not move. She did not pull away. She simply stood there, breathing, her eyes locked on his hand, which was so much larger and darker than her own, resting on her scarred wrist. Then, slowly, she raised her head. Her good eye, the one that had not been swollen shut, met his. It was terrified. It was exhausted, but it was not pleading. It was just watching, waiting. He held her wrist for 1 second, 2. He felt the pulse under his thumb, fast and frightened, but undeniably there. He saw the fire he had sensed, a tiny, defiant spark in the back of her eyes. He released her, his hand dropping slowly to his side. "Careful," he said, his voice rough. "Floor's uneven." "I will be," she whispered. He turned back to the horse, his own hand strangely unsteady. He picked up the mare's hoof, but he was not thinking about the stone he was looking for. He was thinking about the feeling of that small, scarred wrist in his hand, and the terrifying, unspoken promise of the woman who had not pulled away. That moment in the barn, the feeling of his thumb over her pulse, had broken the spell, the fragile peace they had built, made of shared chores and quiet evenings, shattered. Lorna now understood that she had not found a refuge. She had merely brought her storm to his doorstep. That night, she did not stand by the window. She lay on her cot, rigid, her eyes burning in the dark, listening to the sound of his steady breathing from the other side of the room. He was a good man, a quiet, decent man, and she was going to be the death of him. She waited until the first hint of gray light touched the frost on the window pane, the hour just before he would rise to see to the stock. She moved with a practiced stillness, a skill learned in a house where noise was a punishable offense. She had nothing to pack. The ruined dress he had cut from her body was gone, likely burned. The clothes she wore were his, a soft, worn flannel shirt that smelled of wood smoke and soap, and a pair of his old trousers, belted tight with a bit of rope. She found the boots he had left for her by the door, a sturdy pair of his own, long since replaced but still sound. They were far too large, but she stuffed the toes with rags she tore from a discarded flour sack. She salvaged the biscuits left from supper, wrapping them in a cloth. It was a pitiful store, but she had fled with less. She was standing by the door, her hand on the wooden latch, when his voice came out of the darkness behind her. "Where are you going?" Lorna froze, her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, painful rhythm. She turned slowly. Silas was not in his bed. He was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee held in both hands, as if he had been waiting for her. The fire was already lit, casting low, flickering shadows. He had not been asleep at all. I can't stay," she whispered, her voice thick. "It's not right. I am trouble." He looked at her for a long moment. He took in the clumsy, oversized boots, the pathetic bundle of biscuits in her hand, the terror in her eyes. He did not look angry. He looked tired. "You're not trouble to me," he said. His voice was calm, a flat statement of fact. "You don't understand," she pleaded, tears welling. "He'll come looking. The wagon. He'll find me. He'll hurt you for helping me." "He'll have to find you first," Silas said, taking a sip of his coffee. "And this is a big, empty country. Hard to find anything that doesn't want to be found. You don't know him. He'll tear this place apart. He'll tear you apart. I can't let that happen. You saved me. I won't be the reason you're put in the ground." "I see," Silas said. He set his cup down on the table with a quiet click. "So you plan to walk out into 20 miles of mud and melting snow, with no food and no horse, wearing my old boots. You won't last 2 days. The wolves or the cold will get you before he ever does. That's not a solution. That's just a different way to die." She had no answer. The truth of his words pinned her in place. "You're not trouble to me," he said again, his voice softer this time, but with an edge of iron. "You're a guest. Now, you can stand there by the door and catch your death, or you can sit down and have some coffee. I've got to see to the horses." He stood, pulling on his coat. He was so much larger than her. He could have barred the door, could have taken her by the arm. He did neither. He simply walked past her, opened the door, and stepped out into the raw, damp morning, leaving her alone in the cabin. The choice, he had made clear, was hers. She stayed by the door for a full minute, the cold air washing over her. She looked out at the gray, unforgiving landscape. He was right. It was a death sentence, with a sob that was half despair, half relief. She let her hand fall from the latch. She unlaced the heavy boots, her fingers trembling, and went to the fire to get the coffee pot. That night, the dam of their silence broke. They ate supper, a stew she had made, thick with potatoes and a little salt pork, at the small table, for a long time. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against the wooden bowls. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Silas looked up, his brow furrowed. "Why what? Why are you helping me? You don't know me. I lied to you. You know I lied." He pushed his bowl away, Leaning back in his chair, he stared into the fire, his face all hard angles and shadows. "I know," he said. "I know you're running from a man. A husband, I'd guess, from the look of those bruises when you came in. A man who hits." Lorna flinched, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I've lived out here alone for 5 years," he said, his voice quiet, reflective. "Since my brother, Jacob, was killed. You get used to the quiet, but it's a cold life. You're the first person to sit at this table, besides me, since his funeral." He paused, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Maybe I'm just selfish. I like the company." "You're not selfish," she said. "You're decent. I'm not used to decent." "And I'm not used to liars," he countered, though his voice held no heat. "But I reckon you had your reasons. Fear makes people do a lot of things." He fell silent again, and Lorna thought the conversation was over. But then he spoke, his voice lower, rougher. "Jacob wasn't just my brother. He was my partner. We built this cabin together. We were building a herd. We had plans." He picked up a twig from the wood box and held it, turning it over in his fingers. Then the cattle war started. Or rather, it was just one man deciding he wanted the whole valley. A man with more money and more guns than sense. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, began to creep up Lorna's spine. She sat perfectly still. "Luther Maddox," Silas said, and the name was a curse. It dropped into the small cabin like a stone, heavy and cold. "He claimed our creek line was his, said our grazing permits were invalid. We told him to go to hell, so he sent his men." Lorna felt the blood drain from her face. She was cold, so cold she began to shake, though the fire was hot. Luther, he had said the name, her husband. "They came at night," Silas continued, his eyes fixed on the twig, his voice devoid of emotion. "They set fire to the north pasture, drove about 50 head of our cattle off a ravine. Jacob rode out to stop them. I was in town, getting wire." He snapped the twig in his hands. The sharp crack made Lorna jump. "When I got back, the pasture was still smoldering. I found Jacob down by the creek, not far from where I found you. Actually," his voice was flat, "they'd shot him in the back. 3 times. Maddox's men, they left him there as a message." He tossed the broken pieces of the twig into the fire. They smoked, then caught, flaring bright orange. "I buried him," Silas said, "and I've been here ever since. Maddox owns most of this valley now. He's got the law in his pocket, got the governor on his payroll. But he doesn't have this ranch, and he never will, long as I'm breathing." He finally looked at her. His eyes were dark, filled with a grief so old and hard it looked like hate. "So, you see, Lorna, I know a thing or two about men who take what isn't theirs. I know what men like that are capable of, and I don't much like them." Lorna could not breathe. Her throat had closed. This man, this good, kind man who had saved her life, hated her husband, hated him with a righteous, blood-soaked fury. And she was Lorna Maddox, the enemy, the wife of his brother's murderer. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell him, but the words died. He would cast her out. He would hate her, too. She was tainted, part of the disease that had killed his brother. Her silence, which had begun as a shield for herself, now became a shield for him. He was safer not knowing. If he knew who she was, he would fight Maddox on principle. He would die. He saw her face, the stark white terror, the trembling. He mistook it for sympathy. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice softening. "I shouldn't have. That's not a story for supper." "No," she managed to choke out, her voice a strangled whisper. "It's all right. I'm sorry. For your brother." "It was a long time ago," he said, standing. "Don't you mind me?" But she did mind. The irony was a poison. She was living under the roof of the only man in the territory who had a personal reason to kill her husband. And he was protecting her from that very man, all while ignorant of the truth. The confession broke something open in her, too, a few days later, as they were mending a fence. The awkwardness of her secret made her desperate to offer some truth of her own. "He never loved me," she said suddenly, her hands fumbling with the heavy wire. Silas stopped his work, looking at her. "Your husband?" She nodded, not meeting his eyes. "My father. He had land, water rights. My husband wanted them. My father was weak, in debt, so he sold me. That's what it was. A sale." Silas's face hardened. He hammered a staple into the post with one vicious blow. "He controls everything," she continued, the words spilling out now, a torrent of confession. "The house, the money, the horses, who I talk to, what I wear. He tells everyone I'm fragile, delicate. He likes it when I'm sick. He likes it when I'm weak." She was trembling, remembering the suffocating control, the velvet glove over the iron fist. "And when he drinks—" Her voice broke. She stopped, unable to say it. "He beats you," Silas finished for her, his voice flat. She nodded. A single, sharp movement. "He likes to talk. He tells me how worthless I am, how no one else would want me, how I'm his, and then he... "You don't have to say it," Silas said, his voice rough. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder. But he didn't touch her. "I understand." She looked at him then, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I'm not fragile, Silas. I'm so tired of being afraid." "You're not afraid here," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she whispered. "Not of you." A week later, the supplies were running low. The melt had made the roads passable, if treacherous. "I'm riding into Dry Creek," he announced one morning. "We need flour, salt, coffee, and you need clothes. Something that fits." Lorna's stomach clenched. "Town? I can't leave you here for a full day. Not safe. And I can't guess at your size. You'll come with me." The thought of facing other people, of being seen, was terrifying. They'll see me." "They'll see you," he agreed. "And I'll be right there. No one's going to bother you. Lorna, I promise you that." He saddled his steady gelding, Jed for himself, and put her on the mare. Clementine. The ride was slow, the road a river of mud. Lorna had not been on a horse in months. Luther preferred her in a carriage, a delicate doll on display. The simple act of riding, of controlling the animal beneath her, felt like a small, reclaimed freedom. Dry Creek was not much. A single dusty street, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a dozen small houses. But to Lorna, it felt like a city. As they rode down the main street, she felt the eyes. A woman sweeping her porch stopped, her broom held in midair, staring. Two old men sitting outside the saloon went quiet. Lorna pulled her hat. One of Silas's old ones, lower, hunching her shoulders. Silas dismounted in front of Potter's general store and tied both horses to the rail. He turned to help her down. "I can't," she whispered, her hands frozen on the pommel. "They're all looking." "Let them look," Silas said, his voice low. He put his hands on her waist and lifted her down as if she weighed nothing. For a moment, she was pressed against his chest, and she could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart. She hid her face against his shoulder, a small, instinctive movement. "I've got you," he murmured. He kept his hand on the small of her back as they walked inside. The bell above the door jangled. Mr. Potter, a thin man with spectacles, looked up. "Silas, good to see you. Heard you wintered well." "Well enough. Elias," Silas said. "Need some basics. Flour, 50 pounds. Coffee. Salt." "And who's this?" "Mr. Potter asked, his eyes sliding to Lorna. who was trying to make herself invisible behind Silas's shoulder. "A friend," Silas said, his voice flat, leaving no room for questions. "She'll be needing a dress, maybe two, and some proper boots." A stout woman, Mrs. Potter, emerged from the back. Her eyes raked over Lorna, taking in the faded bruises, the oversized men's clothes. Her lips pursed in disapproval. "We have some ready-mades," she said, her voice tight. "This way." Lorna had to step away from Silas. It felt like stepping off a cliff. As she followed Mrs. Potter, she could hear the whispers from other customers in the store. She heard the words bruised and strange. She kept her eyes on the floor, her face burning with shame. When they left, Silas loaded the heavy sacks onto Jed. Lorna clutched a small bundle of two simple, sturdy calico dresses and new boots. As they mounted, she saw a man in a familiar-looking coat staring at them from across the street. He was one of Luther's men, a ranch hand named Griggs. Her blood turned to ice. He hadn't seen her face, but he was watching Silas. He was watching the woman with Silas. "We have to go," she said, her voice strained. "Silas, please!" He saw the direction of her gaze, saw the man, and his face darkened. He nodded once. "Ride." They left town at a fast trot. The sky had been threatening all day. A low, bruised purple ceiling. 10 miles from the ranch, it broke. The rain did not start gently. It came in a sudden, violent deluge, turning the muddy road into a slick, treacherous river. The temperature dropped, and the rain quickly became a stinging, half-frozen sleet. "We can't make it back," Silas yelled over the roar of the wind. "There's an old way station, up here." He grabbed Clementine's bridle and pulled her off the road. Up a steep, muddy incline, Lorna clung to the saddle, soaked to the bone in seconds, her new dress plastered to her skin. The way station was barely a cabin. It was a one-room line shack, long abandoned. The door hung on one hinge, and part of the roof was gone. But it had 3 solid walls and a stone fireplace. Silas shoved the horses into a ramshackle lean-to behind the building, then pushed Lorna inside the main room. It was dark, cold, and smelled of rat droppings and wet earth. "Get out of those clothes," he ordered, his voice sharp. He was already pulling at his own soaked coat. "What?" "You'll freeze. Get them off. Now!" He wasn't asking. He was trying to save her life. Again. He rummaged in his saddlebags, which he'd thrown in the corner, and pulled out his dry bedroll. "Wrap yourself in this." He turned his back to her, a gesture of decency that made her heart ache. With fumbling, frozen fingers, she unbuttoned the wet calico. It felt like ice against her skin. She dropped it in a heap on the floor and wrapped herself in his thick wool bedroll, a cocoon of dry, warm wool that smelled like him. He built a fire with the desperate, crackling speed of a man who knew the cold. He found some dry wood left by a previous traveler, stacked in a high corner. Soon, a small, smoky fire was fighting against the damp. They sat on the floor, side by side, leaning against the wall. Lorna was wrapped in his bedroll. He was stripped to his long underwear, his own blanket wrapped around his shoulders, their wet clothes steamed by the hearth. Outside, the storm raged, a terrifying, elemental fury. "I hate the rain," Lorna whispered, her teeth chattering. "I hate storms." "Most people do," he said, staring into the flames. "No," she said. My husband, he was always worse when it stormed. He said it made his bones ache. He would drink, and he'd get mean." She pulled the bedroll tighter. "I'd hide. I'd try to make myself small, but the house wasn't big enough." She looked at Silas. His face was lit by the fire, his profile strong, his jaw set. He was listening. "I haven't felt safe in years," she admitted, the words tasting strange on her tongue. It was the truest thing she had ever said. "Not for one single day." Until I woke up in your cabin." She looked down. "And that's the worst part. I'm safe with you, but I've made you unsafe. That man in town." "I saw him," Silas said, his voice grim. "He works for my husband. He'll go back. He'll tell him." "Tell him what? He saw me in town with a woman. He doesn't know who you are." "He'll describe me. My husband. He's a smart man. He'll know." Silas turned to look at her. The space between them was only a few inches. The small fire lit the intensity in his eyes. "Then we'll be ready for him." "You don't even know who he is," she cried, her voice breaking. "I know what he is," Silas said, his voice rough. "That's all that matters." He was so close. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a solid, living warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He was looking at her, not at her scars or her fear, but at her. He raised a hand, his movement slow, as if not to startle her. His rough, calloused fingers brushed a strand of wet, dark hair from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent. It was not the touch of a savior or a brother. It was the touch of a man. Lorna stopped breathing. He leaned in. She saw his eyes close. She leaned in, too. Their kiss was not gentle. It was not practiced. It was hesitant, then desperate. It was breathless and trembling. It tasted of rain and wood smoke and a loneliness so profound it was almost a physical pain. It was the first kiss of her life that was not an act of ownership, but a question. It was clumsy and searching, and it broke her open. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. He was breathing heavily, as if he'd been running. Lorna began to cry. It was not the silent, fearful weeping he was used to. It was a storm. Great, tearing sobs that came from her very center, a release of years of terror and shame, and a new, terrifying hope. Silas did not shush her. He did not question her. He simply pulled her closer, shifting so her head was on his shoulder, his arms wrapped around her. Bedroll and all, he just held her, his hand stroking her hair, his own body tense. He held her as the fire burned low and the storm screamed its fury outside the broken door, saying nothing, offering only the solid, unwavering shelter of his presence. They returned to the ranch the next afternoon, the world washed clean and dripping. The horses were tired, the sacks of flour heavy, but the air in the cabin was no longer one of quiet companionship. It was charged, thick with unspoken words. That night, they ate in their usual silence, but it was a different kind. It was not comfortable. It was electric. Every time his hand brushed hers as they reached for the salt, a jolt went through her. Every time she looked up and found him watching her, her breath caught. He did not touch her. He did not try to kiss her again. He treated her with the same quiet respect as always. But something fundamental had shifted between them. A barrier had been crossed, and there was no going back. She went to her cot, and he to his, but she did not sleep. She lay awake, her body humming, her skin alive. She was terrified. She was terrified of the man who was hunting her, terrified of the secret she was keeping, and terrified of this new, alien feeling. It was desire. It was raw and deep, and it was aimed at Silas. She wanted him. She wanted his quiet strength, his calloused hands, his steady presence. She wanted to feel safe, but she also wanted to feel him. She, who had been taught that all touch was pain, that all intimacy was violation, found herself wanting, fearfully and completely, to be touched by this man. She was afraid of what it meant, afraid of what it would cost him. But the wanting was a fire in her belly, a defiant spark that even Luther's cruelty had never managed to extinguish. It was, she realized, the most dangerous feeling of all. The kiss in the way station had drawn a line in the dirt. The days that followed were thick with a new, agonizing tension. They moved around the small cabin with a forced, careful choreography, a pantomime of their old routine. They cooked, they mended, they stoked the fire, but they did not talk about the rain or the kiss. or the way their hands sometimes brushed when they reached for the coffee pot. Every accidental touch was a spark, and they were two people living in a tinderbox, terrified of the inferno. Lorna was haunted. She had cried in his arms, a raw, animal grief. He had held her, and in his arms, she had felt, for one brief, impossible moment, not just safe, but wanted. Now, in the light of day, she was ashamed. She had invited this quiet, solitary man into her chaos. She had taken his kindness and stained it with her own desperate needs. Silas was grim. He chopped wood with a contained violence, the axe splitting the logs with sharp, definitive cracks. He had kissed her. He had tasted the rain and the fear on her lips. And he had felt something shift inside him, something he had buried with his brother. He was a man who understood fences. He knew how to build them, how to maintain them. But the fence he had built around himself for 5 years had been breached, and he did not know how to repair it. The standoff was broken by the arrival of a horse. Lorna, who was washing a skillet, dropped it with a clatter. She ran to the window, her face pale. Silas was already at the door, rifle in hand. He stepped outside. "It's all right," he called to her, his voice low. "It's just Abe." A man on a short, muscled buckskin rode into the yard. He was older than Silas, his face a map of sun-scorched wrinkles, his beard gray and tobacco-stained. He nodded to Silas, his eyes glancing at the cabin, where Lorna was a shadow in the window. "Silas," the man said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He did not dismount. "Abe, what's the news?" "Just came from town. Thought I'd ride the North Line, check on that stray heifer. Figured I'd stop." Abe shifted in his saddle, looking uncomfortable. "It's talk, mostly." "What talk?" Silas kept his voice even. "That hand of Maddox's, the one you pointed out to me last month. Griggs. He's still in Dry Creek. Been there 3 days. He's taken a room at the saloon. Buying whiskey for anyone who'll listen." Lorna, pressed against the inside wall of the cabin, could hear their voices, muffled but clear. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat. "What's he asking?" Silas asked. "That's the thing," Abe said. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "He's not asking about cattle. He's asking about you." Silas went very still. "Me?" "Aye. Asking if you've been in town. Asking if you're the solitary type. Asking real casual-like. If you've had any visitors, any strangers pass through." Abe finally looked straight at Silas. "He's asking about a woman. Silas, a woman who might have gotten lost in the storm." The world tilted. Lorna put a hand against the rough log wall to steady herself. He knew. Luther knew. Silas's face was a mask of stone. "Is that so?" "That's so," Abe confirmed. "Elias Potter mentioned you'd bought some ladies' clothes." The talk. Well, it's getting louder. Griggs is offering money for information. Maddox money. I'm obliged for the news. Abe, you see that heifer? Run her back." "Will do." Abe gathered his reins, his gaze lingering on the cabin door. "You watch yourself. Silas, Maddox's money always comes with blood on it." "I know it." Abe nodded, turned his horse, and rode out, his form diminishing against the vast, empty plains. Silas stood in the yard for a long time, his back to the cabin. Lorna watched him, her breath trapped in her chest. She saw his shoulders, broad and tense under his shirt. He was a mountain, and she was the fool who had started an avalanche. When he finally came inside, he did not look at her. He moved with a terrifying, deliberate calm. He walked to the hearth, picked up the poker, and stared into the flames. "You heard him," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she whispered. "That man in town," Silas said, his voice quiet. "The one who works for your husband, he's asking for you." She had nowhere left to run. The lies, the half-truths, the omissions, they had all piled up around her, and now they were about to collapse. "Silas?" she began, her voice trembling so hard she could barely form the words. He turned to face her. His eyes were not angry. They were worse. They were cold, assessing, the eyes of a stranger. "You told me your name was Lorna. You told me you were in a wagon accident." I was afraid." "You were afraid," he repeated, his voice flat. "But you weren't afraid to lie. You weren't afraid to stay here, in my house, eating my food. You weren't afraid to let me ride into town with you." "I didn't know what else to do," she cried, the tears finally coming, hot and sharp. "Where could I go?" "You could have told me the truth," he said, his voice rising for the first time, a sharp crack of sound that made her flinch. He saw the flinch, and his face tightened. He lowered his voice. "Who is he, Lorna? Who is the man who left those bruises? Who is the man who has his dog, Griggs, sniffing around my land?" She was shaking her head, sobbing, unable to speak the name. It was the one word that would destroy everything. "Tell me," he commanded. "Tell me his name." She looked at him, her vision blurred by tears, her entire body shaking. You said your brother—" A new, dreadful understanding dawned on Silas's face. The coldness was replaced by a look of slow dawning horror. "My brother, Jacob." "The man," she choked out, "the man who you said—" "Maddox," Silas whispered. The name was a dead thing in the room. He stared at her, his mind visibly connecting the pieces, the bruises, the terror, the lies, the man in town, his brother's murder. "Your name," he said, his voice hollow. "It's not just Lorna." "It's Lorna Maddox," she confessed, and the world caved in. "Luther Maddox is my husband." Silas recoiled. It was not a large movement, but it was as if she had physically struck him. He took a step back, his hand coming up to brace himself against the stone of the hearth. He looked at her as if he had never seen her before, as if she were a snake, a thing of poison that had hidden in his bed. "His wife," Silas said. The words were flat, dead. I didn't know," she pleaded, desperation making her words frantic. "When I came here, I didn't know who you were. I just ran, and when you told me about your brother, I was so afraid. I thought you'd hate me. I thought you'd send me back to him." He was not listening. He had turned away from her, his back rigid. He was staring out the small, grimy window at the endless, unforgiving plains. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. She could almost see the war raging inside him. The rage was a physical presence in the room, a low, vibrating hum. He was the brother of a murdered man, and she was the wife of the murderer. She was the enemy, sleeping under his roof. The betrayal of it was absolute. He had shared his grief with her, his most private wound, and she had sat there, a living, breathing part of the lie that had caused it. And then there was the ache. He was remembering the way she felt in his arms, her small weight, the taste of her lips. He was remembering the sound of her weeping in the night, the way she flinched at loud noises, the scar on her wrist. He was a man torn in two. The past was demanding vengeance. The present was pleading for mercy. "Silas," she whispered, terrified of his silence. "Say something. Please, yell at me. Hit me. But don't be quiet." He turned, his face a terrible, unreadable mask. "Get your things." Her heart stopped. It was over. He was casting her out. "No, Silas, please. He'll kill me. I swear to you. He will kill me. Or he'll kill you for hiding me. Don't you see? I was trying to protect you." "You protected me by lying?" His voice was ice. "You protected me by bringing his war to my door." "I'll go," she said, collapsing into herself. She sank onto the small stool by the fire, her body racked with sobs. "I'll go. I won't be a trouble to you. Just don't make me go back to him. I'll go north. I'll walk." He watched her, this broken woman who was the wife of his mortal enemy. He saw the truth in her terror. She was not a conspirator. She was a victim, just as his brother had been. She was just another piece of the world that Luther Maddox had tried to break. His decision was made, not in his head, but in his gut. It was a physical, non-negotiable thing. He did not say another word. He stalked past her, his boots heavy on the plank floor. She flinched as he passed, expecting a blow. But he went to the corner where he kept his tools. He picked up his hammer, a box of long nails, and a stack of old boards he'd been saving to repair the corn crib. Lorna watched, confused, as he went to the front window. With 3 decisive, violent blows, he hammered a board across the glass. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the small cabin. He moved to the back window. Hammer, nail, board, hammer, nail, board. He was not sending her away. He was sealing them in. He came back to the center of the room, now lit only by the fire and a single, grime-caked window he had left clear for a firing line. He looked at her, his face still grim, the rage still there, but it was now channeled. It had a purpose. "He'll come," Silas said. "Griggs will go back and tell him a woman is here. He'll put it together, and he'll come." He went to his cot, grabbed his bedroll, and threw it on the floor next to the front door. He took his rifle from the wall mount, checked the action, and laid it down on the blankets. "You sleep in the bed," he said. His voice was flat. "Bar the door after me." He went out, leaving her in the fortified, fire-lit gloom. A minute later, he returned, his arms full of firewood, enough to last for days. He stacked it by the hearth, then went to the door and dropped the heavy iron bar into place. He was not his brother's avenger, not yet. He was a guardian. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and began, with steady, practiced hands, to clean his rifle. He had made his choice. The next few days were a waking nightmare. They were prisoners in the small cabin, bound by the boards on the windows and the threat on the horizon. The dim fire-lit space was a pressure cooker. The air was thick with fear, with unspoken words, and with the electric, terrifying intimacy of 2 people preparing for a siege. The silence was gone. Now, they talked. He sat by the door, his rifle always within reach. She sat by the fire, her hands never still, mending, kneading dough, anything to keep from screaming. He asked her questions, his voice low and urgent. "Tell me about him, about Maddox." And she did. She told him everything. She told him about Luther's arrogance, his belief that everyone and everything was for sale. She told him about the gunmen he kept on his payroll, men like Griggs, who were more like wolves than men. She told him about his rages, his cold, calculating cruelty, his obsession with his legacy. "He doesn't want me," she whispered into the gloom, her voice raw. "Not really. He just can't stand for something of his to be taken. He thinks I'm his property, like his land, like his cattle, and he'll slaughter anyone who touches what's his." Silas listened, his face hard. He was gathering intelligence, learning his enemy, but he was also doing something else. He was looking at her, really looking at her, and the last of his rage was burning away, leaving only a hard, protective ache. He was separating the woman from the name she carried. The tension between them stretched, hour after hour, until it was a wire humming, ready to snap. The kiss in the way station felt like it had happened a lifetime ago, to 2 different people. Now, their shared fear was a more potent, more dangerous intimacy. It happened on the 3rd night. A storm had blown in, the wind shrieking around the corners of the cabin, rattling the newly boarded windows. It sounded like a mob, like the world was trying to tear its way in. Lorna could not sleep. She lay on his cot, her body rigid, her heart pounding with every gust. She could not bear the waiting. She could not bear the dark. She rose, her bare feet silent on the floor. He was not on his bedroll. He was standing by the one clear window, a dark silhouette against the moonlit, wind-swept plains, staring out, waiting.
"Silas?"
she whispered. He turned. His face was all shadow, but she could feel the tension coming off him in waves. "Go back to sleep. Lorna, it's just the wind." "I can't," she said. She walked toward him, drawn by his stillness. "I can't sleep. I can't. I keep thinking. I keep seeing them riding up. I keep seeing—" She couldn't say it. She stopped, standing just in front of him. She could smell the faint, clean scent of the soap he used, the wood smoke on his clothes. "You should be 1,000 miles from here," he said, his voice rough. "You should have never come here." "I know," she whispered. "But I'm here, and I'm so scared. I'm so scared for you." He looked down at her, this small, terrified woman who was at the center of his brother's war, this woman who had lied to him, who carried his enemy's name, this woman he had kissed in the rain. "I'm not," he said, and he realized, as he said it, that it was true. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his chest. It was an impulsive, desperate gesture. She just needed to feel that he was real, solid. She felt the hard muscle under his shirt, the steady beat of his heart. Her fingers brushed against a line of raised, puckered skin just below his collarbone, a scar. He inhaled sharply at her touch, but he did not pull away. She looked up at him, her eyes wide in the gloom. He was not a savior. He was not a saint. He was a man, scarred and solitary, who had chosen to stand between her and the darkness. The wind howled, a long, mournful cry. It was the sound of their shared future, of the violence that was coming. He lowered his head. She rose on her toes. This kiss was not like the first. There was no hesitation. It was a raw, desperate collision. It was a drowning man's grasp for air. It was all the fear, and the waiting, and the rage, and the terrible, aching loneliness of their lives, ignited. His hands went to her waist, pulling her against him, hard. His lips were rough, demanding. He was claiming her, marking her, a defiant act against the man who hunted her. She clung to him, her hands moving from his chest up to his shoulders, her fingers gripping him. He lifted her, his arms like steel bands, and carried her the few feet to his bedroll by the door. He did not lay her down gently. He fell with her, into the nest of blankets, his body covering hers, his mouth never leaving hers. It was raw, it was vulnerable, it was intense. She tore at the buttons of his shirt, needing to feel his skin. Her hands rediscovered the scar on his chest, tracing it, a map of the pain he'd carried. He pulled at the simple dress she wore, his hands shaking, his breath hot on her neck. He was not gentle. He was desperate, and she met his desperation with her own. When he finally pushed into her, she cried out, a sound that was half pain, half release. This was not the cold, clinical violation she had known. This was fire. This was a grounding. He was an anchor in the storm, and she wrapped herself around him, taking all of him. He moved with a rhythm that was all for her, his eyes locked on hers in the dim light. He was looking at her as if she were something holy, something precious and breakable that he was trying to weld to himself. He was branding her, and she was branding him right back. It was a promise made in the flesh, in the dark, with the wind screaming for their blood. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets, their bodies slick with sweat, the air in the cabin still and heavy. The storm outside seemed to have quieted, or perhaps they just could not hear it. Lorna lay with her head on his chest, her ear pressed against the steady, slowing thump of his heart. The scar was under her cheek. She had never, in her entire life, felt so completely, terrifyingly safe. She had given him the last thing she had, and now she had to give him the last truth. She lay there for a long time, listening to his breathing. Finally, she gathered her courage. "Silas," she whispered. Her voice was thick. "Hmm?" His voice was a low rumble beneath her ear. There's something else. Something I didn't tell you." He went very still. She felt the muscles in his chest tense. "What?" She pushed herself up on one elbow so she could see his face in the dying firelight. She was so ashamed, she could barely meet his eyes. The reason I ran that night, Luther, he was angry, and I found out that day." "Found out what, Lorna?" His voice was patient, but edged with a new tension. She took a breath. "I'm with child." The words hung in the air, heavier than any threat. Silas did not move. He did not breathe. He just stared at her, his face impossible to read. The silence stretched, pulling taut, seconds becoming minutes. The hope, the fierce, burning connection of moments before, all of it evaporated. "Is it his?" he asked. His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. She could not speak. The shame was a physical thing, choking her. She nodded once, a small, jerky movement. A single tear escaped, tracing a hot path down her temple. "I found out that morning," she whispered. I was going to tell him, but he was drinking, and I just ran." He moved. He sat up, swinging his legs off the bedroll, his back to her. He was a solid wall of shadow. Lorna's heart broke. This was the one thing he could not forgive. She was carrying his enemy's child. She was a vessel for the Maddox legacy. He stood, his tall form silhouetted against the dying embers. He walked to the window, the one he had left uncovered. He stood there, just as he had before, staring out at the dark land. He was thinking of Jacob, shot in the back, bleeding out by the creek. He was thinking of Luther Maddox, a man who poisoned everything he touched, and now that poison was here. It was inside this woman. But then he looked at Lorna. She was huddled in his blankets, her face pale with shame, her body trembling. She was not Luther Maddox. She was the woman he had pulled from the snow, the woman who had mended his shirt, the woman who had cried in his arms in the way station, the woman who had just given herself to him with a desperate, trusting passion. The child. It was not Luther. It was an innocent. It was a life, as trapped in this as she was. He walked back to her. She flinched as he approached, pulling the blanket up, trying to hide. She thought he would curse her, or hit her, or, worst of all, just walk out the door and leave her. He did none of those things. He knelt beside the bedroll. He knelt before her. He reached out, his hand rough and gently. He touched her face, his thumb brushing away the tear on her cheek. "That child's innocent," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "Just like you were." He was not just forgiving her. He was claiming them. Both of them. The next morning, the tender vulnerability of the night was gone, replaced by a grim, focused energy. Silas was a man of action. He pulled Abe's horse from the barn, where it had been sheltered, and scribbled a note. "Abe," he said to his foreman, "I need you to ride, not just to the neighbors, to every small ranch in this valley. You tell them I'm calling in my markers. You tell them Luther Maddox is coming for me. They don't have to fight, but they need to know. Tell them to stay clear. Tell them I'm making my stand." Abe looked from Silas's hard face to the barred windows of the cabin. He nodded once. "I'll tell them." He mounted and rode out, a man on a desperate mission. Silas did not wait. He could not sit here, a target. He had to know what Maddox was doing. He saddled Jed, his own gelding. "Lorna," he said, his voice all command, "bar the door behind me. Do not open it. Not for Abe, not for God, not for anyone but me. You hear me?" "Where are you going?" she asked, her hands clutching the front of her dress. "To town," he said. "I need to know what we're facing." He rode hard, the wind at his back. He bypassed Potter's store. He went straight to the saloon, the dark, smoky heart of Dry Creek. He pushed through the batwing doors, his face set. The saloon was half full, the usual collection of drifters, ranch hands, and townsfolk. He saw Griggs in a back corner, a bottle and 2 glasses on his table, talking to a pair of hard-looking men. Silas ignored them. He went to the bar, laid a coin down. "Whiskey," he said. He took the glass and stood at the end of the bar, his back to the wall, listening. The air was thick with smoke and talk. He heard his own name. He heard Maddox's, and then he heard the words that turned his blood to ice. "He's put a bounty on her," a man whispered to his neighbor, 2 stools down. "A bounty on his own wife?" $500, the man said, his voice low with avarice. "That's what Griggs is spreading. $500 for the woman. Says she stole from him." "500, the other man mused. "What's the catch?" The first man leaned in, his voice dropping so low Silas could barely hear him. "He wants her brought to his ranch, alive or not." "Alive or not?" It was not a retrieval. It was a death warrant. It was a license to kill her, and anyone who stood with her. Silas finished his whiskey in one burning swallow. He set the glass down, his hand steady. He walked out of the saloon, his face carved from stone. He mounted his horse and rode back toward the ranch, the 2 words echoing with every hoofbeat, alive or not. He looked at the horizon, at the small, dark shape of his cabin, a fortress that suddenly seemed as fragile as paper. He was gone. Silas had ridden into town, into the den of wolves, and she was alone. Lorna stood in the center of the cabin, a prisoner in a fortress of his making. The boards on the windows cast the room in a striped, unnatural gloom, the air thick with the smell of old wood, fear, and the dying embers of the fire. The silence was a physical weight. It was too quiet. It was the quiet of a trap, of a snare pulled taut. She had brought this, Lorna Maddox, had brought this doom upon the only good man she had ever known. He was in town, and she could see it, clear as a vision. Griggs, the saloon, the whispers. Silas, righteous and stubborn, defending her. A gunshot. Silas, lying in the mud of Dry Creek. The thought was a spike of ice in her heart. She began to pace, her feet restless on the plank floor, from the hearth to the door, from the door to the cot. A caged animal. She had to do something. She could not just wait here for him to die for her. Her eyes fell on a small, battered trunk in the corner. It was where Silas had tossed the ruined, filthy clothes she had been wearing when he found her, the rags he had cut from her body. He had meant to burn them, but the storm, and then the siege, had interrupted. She walked to it, a strange compulsion pulling her. She opened the lid. There it was, the dark wool dress, stiff with frozen mud, the fabric torn and stained. It was the shroud of her old life. She reached in, her fingers trembling. To pull it out, she would burn it now. She would destroy the last piece of Lorna Maddox. As she lifted the dress, something fell from a hidden fold, an envelope, heavy and white, wrapped in oilskin to protect it from the weather. It was not muddy. It was clean. It had not been put there by the storm. It had been put there by a hand. She knew the handwriting before she even saw the name. It was Luther's, precise, elegant, and cold. It was not addressed to anyone. It was a statement. Her fingers were numb, clumsy. As she broke the wax seal, she unfolded the single sheet of thick, expensive paper. There were only 2 lines. "You can run, but you can never hide. I will always find what is mine." She did not scream. A cold, profound emptiness hollowed her out. This note. He had put this note on her before she fled. She had found it in a hidden pocket sewn into the lining, a place she kept a small amount of emergency money. He had found the pocket. He had replaced the money with this. He knew. He had known she would run. He had, perhaps, even encouraged it. He was not hunting her. He was playing with her. She was a fox, and he had already set the hounds. Abe's words. Griggs in town, asking questions. The bounty. It was not a search. It was a performance. It was a warning to everyone else in the territory. This is what happens when you touch the property of Luther Maddox. And Silas, with his stubborn pride, his grief for his brother, his newfound terrifying tenderness for her. Silas was not a man. He was a message. Luther would kill him slowly, publicly, to prove his point. No, she whispered, the word a dry rasp. She would not be his game. She would not be the trap that killed Silas Vane. Her panic crystallized into a terrible, cold resolve. She ran to the door, her hands shaking so violently she could barely lift the heavy iron bar. She shoved it aside, the noise echoing in the small cabin. She burst out into the pale, cold sunlight. She ran to the barn, her borrowed boots slipping in the mud. Jed, Silas's gelding, and Clementine, the mare, nickered at her from their stalls. She had to take one. It was his property. It was stealing, but it was better than letting him be murdered. She threw a saddle onto Clementine. Her fingers were clumsy with the buckles, her breath coming in ragged, tearing sobs. She did not know where she was going. North, into the mountains, into the canyons, anywhere. She would draw them away from him. She would ride until the horse died. And then she would walk. He would find the horse gone, find her gone, and he would be safe. He would curse her, hate her, but he would be alive. She mounted, kicking the mare into a desperate, panicked run. She did not look back. Silas rode hard from town, the two words from the saloon echoing in his head. Alive or not. It was a death warrant. It was a license for any trigger-happy drifter to put a bullet in her for $500. He had left her alone. He had been a fool. He topped the rise, his eyes straining for the cabin. He saw it, and his blood froze. The door was open. He spurred Jed, the horse leaping forward, sensing the cold terror in its rider. He rode into the yard at a gallop, jumping from the saddle before the horse had even stopped. Lorna! He burst into the cabin, his rifle raised. Lorna! It was empty. The air was cold, the fire dead. The heavy bar was on the floor, on the stool. He saw the muddy, ruined dress, and beside it, a white envelope. He snatched it up. He read the words, "I will always find what is mine." Damn him, he breathed. He knew. He had known. This was a game to him. He ran to the barn, his heart a cold stone in his chest. Jed stood, winded. Clementine's stall was empty. He did not need to think. He knew. He had seen the terror in her eyes, her desperate, suicidal need to protect him. She had not been taken. She had fled. He ran back to Jed. A man possessed. He checked the tracks in the mud. One horse riding hard, heading north toward the Badlands, toward the canyon. He mounted, his face carved from granite. "You fool," he whispered. Not to her, but to himself. "You damned stubborn fool." He was not a man driven by rage. He was a man driven by a fear so pure and cold it was a fire in his veins. He had pulled her from the ice, only to watch her run to her death. He tracked her easily. She was riding in a blind panic, not even trying to cover her trail. He followed the prints through the sucking mud of the flats, up into the rocky shale of the foothills. He pushed Jed, the horse straining, its breath coming in white plumes. He found her an hour later. She was at the edge of the great northern canyon, a 1,000-foot drop of red rock and shadow. She had stopped, the mare blowing, its head hanging. Lorna was just sitting there, staring into the vast, empty chasm. It was the end of the world. Lorna. His voice was a roar, the sound of his terror ripping out of him. She spun in the saddle, her face a mask of wind and tears. She saw him, and her expression was not one of relief. It was one of horror. "No! Go back! Silas! Go back!" He dismounted, his legs unsteady, and stalked toward her. He was furious. He was shaking. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? Are you insane? You'd ride off a cliff? Is that your plan?" "I'm saving you!" she screamed, her voice cracking, breaking against the wind. She slid from the horse, backing away from him, toward the edge. "Go back! He'll kill you! He put a bounty on me! $500! I heard it!" Silas stopped, the wind whipping his coat. "I know," he said, his voice raw. "I heard it in town. Alive, or not." "Then you know," she cried, sobbing. "You know he wants me dead, but he'll kill you just for being with me. He'll make an example of you. I won't let you die for me. I won't be the reason. Go back, Silas. Please, tell them I stole your horse. Tell them I threatened you. Tell them anything, but just let me go." He walked toward her, his steps slow, deliberate. "And where will you go? Lorna? Into that?" He nodded at the canyon. "That's not a plan. That's suicide. You're pregnant. You won't last a single night out here." "It's better than letting him murder you," she shrieked, her voice thin against the howl of the wind. I won't have your blood on my hands." He was in front of her now. He grabbed her by the arms, his fingers biting into her flesh. "You don't get to make that choice for me," he shouted, his face inches from hers. "You don't get to decide who I live or die for. My life is mine, not yours, and not his." The fight went out of her. The fury, the terror, it all just collapsed. She fell against him, her body racked with sobs, her fists beating uselessly against his chest. "He'll kill you," she wept. "He'll kill you, and it will be my fault." He wrapped his arms around her, crushing her to him. His own fear and anger broke, and he buried his face in her wind-tangled hair, his body shaking. They stood there, two small, broken figures on the edge of an abyss, clinging to each other as the only solid things in a world that was trying to tear them apart. He held her until the sobbing quieted, until they were just two people, trembling in the cold. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs wiping the tears from her cheeks. His eyes were fierce, the grim certainty back. "You listen to me," he said, his voice low and hard. "You are not his. You are not his property, and you are not his to kill." He took a ragged breath. "You think I'm letting you go alone? You think I'm letting you ride out here and die, carrying... He stopped. He could not say, "my child." It was too new, too fragile. "You are not going alone." He stepped back, pulling her with him, away from the edge. "If we run together, or we don't run at all." She stared at him, her eyes wide, still red from weeping. "Run? Run where? He has men everywhere. He has the law." "Not where we're going," Silas said. He pulled her toward the horses. He checked her saddle, tightening the cinch with a vicious tug. "We're going to the high country, to the mountains. I have a friend, an old army friend, Amos Jacoby. He runs a trading post north of the Ute lands. It's a hard place. Maddox's money doesn't spend well there." He mounted Jed, then reached down, his arm like steel, and pulled her up, seating her in front of him. "We'll ride Jed. The mare will follow. We'll ride faster this way." He wheeled the horse, turning his back on the canyon, his arm a possessive, protective bar across her waist, holding her tight against his chest. "Hold on," he said, and he dug his heels in, pushing the horse into a hard, desperate run toward the snow-capped peaks on the horizon. They rode for 3 days. They did not stop for more than an hour at a time. They bypassed the trails, staying to the high ridges, the rocky game paths where pursuit would be harder. The plains gave way to foothills, the foothills to sharp, pine-covered slopes. The air grew thin and cold. Lorna rode in a daze of exhaustion. She was not a seasoned rider, and the constant, jarring pace left her body a constellation of aches. She was sick every morning, a bitter, empty heaving, But she said nothing. She just clung to the pommel, her back pressed against Silas's solid chest, his strength the only thing holding her upright. He was a machine. He did not seem to sleep. He did not complain. He just watched, his eyes constantly scanning their back trail, his rifle always resting across his lap. They ate jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, sharing sips of metallic-tasting water from his canteen. On the third night, the weather turned. The cold wind they had been fighting all day brought a wet, heavy spring snow. It came down in thick, wet flakes, blinding them, turning the rocky trail into a treacherous slick. "We have to stop," Silas yelled over the wind. "The horses! They'll break a leg! We'll freeze!" He had been scanning the ridges, and he turned Jed, heading for a small cleft in the rocks, a dark overhang he had spotted. It was not a cave, it was barely a shelter, an old, three-sided trapper's shack, made of rotted logs, the roof half collapsed. But it was out of the wind. He half lifted, half dragged her from the horse. She was so cold she could barely stand, her legs buckling. He pushed her into the small, dark space, then tethered the exhausted horses close, where they could share what little body heat was left. He used his knife and the last of his strength to cut down dead, snow-covered branches, and with his flint, he managed to start a small, smoky, hissing fire. It was a pathetic thing, but it was heat. They huddled together, Silas's one bedroll wrapped around both of them. They were pressed tight, hip to hip, shoulder to shoulder. The snow hissed as it hit the edges of their fire. I'm so cold," Lorna whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. "I know," he said, his voice a rough rasp. "I know." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, and he began to rub her back. Her arms, his calloused hands rough against her skin, trying to force warmth, to force life back into her. His hands were frantic, desperate. He was terrified. She was too cold. Her skin was like ice. He rubbed her hands between his, blowing his own warm breath onto her frozen fingers. "Silas," she whispered. He looked at her. Her face was blue-white in the flickering, meager firelight. Her eyes were huge, dark pools of fear. "Don't let me die here," she said. "I won't," he said, his voice thick. "I won't." His touch changed. It was no longer just practical. He was holding her face, his thumbs stroking her temples. He was looking at her as if she were the last living thing on earth. They were going to die, here in the snow, in this miserable hovel, and Maddox would win. He leaned in and kissed her. His lips were cold, chapped. Hers were too. It was not a passionate kiss. It was slow. It was desperate. It was a kiss that said, "We are still alive." He pulled the bedroll open, his hands fumbling with the buttons of her coat, and then his own. "We need warmth," he muttered, though it was not just that. It was a lie they both needed to believe. He pulled her against his bare skin, the shock of his cold flesh against hers making them both gasp. But then their shared, meager heat began to build, a tiny furnace against the vast, frozen world. He made love to her, slowly, desperately. It was not the fire of the cabin. It was the last ember in a dying hearth. It was two people, hunted and freezing, clinging to each other, a final, defiant act of life. It was a shared warmth, a silent promise, a way of feeling something other than the cold and the fear. He held her afterward, his body covering hers, their skin pressed together under the wool blankets. The fire was almost dead, but they were warm. "I won't let him find you," he whispered into her hair, his vow lost to the sound of the wind. "I swear it." She pressed her face against his chest, against the scar she had come to know. "I'm not his," she whispered back, a vow of her own. "I was never his. If I am anything, I am yours." Miles behind them, in the valley they had fled, the night was lit by a different kind of fire, Griggs and 4 other men sat on their horses, watching Silas Vane's barn burn. The flames leaped high, a pillar of orange against the dark sky, consuming the hay, the tack, the feed, the very memory of his life. "He ain't coming back here," one of the men said, his face lit by the blaze. Griggs spat into the dirt. "He's heading for the high country. I know that mule-headed friend of his, Jacoby, up at the post. That's where he's running." He smiled, a cold, thin expression. "Maddox is on his way. He said he wants to be there for the finish." He turned his horse. "Let's ride. Let them freeze for a day or two. It'll make the end that much sweeter." Luther Maddox rode at the head of a different column. 6 fresh men, 6 fresh horses. He was not a man to be trifled with. He was dressed for the weather, his face set. He was not just reclaiming a wife. He was reclaiming his legacy. The child she carried was his blood, his heir, and he would tear down the mountains, stone by stone, to get it back. He would kill the man who had dared to touch his property, and he would drag his wife home, where she belonged. 2 days later, 2 figures who looked more like ghosts than people stumbled out of the snow line and into the small, fortified yard of Amos Jacoby's trading post. The post was a log fortress built into the side of a mountain, overlooking the only pass for 50 miles. Before they had taken 2 steps, the heavy door opened, and a mountain of a man stepped out. He was missing one eye. His face was a mass of beard and scars, and he held a long rifle as if it were part of his arm. "Silas?" the man's voice growled, a sound like rocks grinding together. "By God, I thought you were a wraith. You look like one." "Amos," Silas croaked. He could barely stand. He held Lorna up, who was half conscious. "Amos, we need help." Amos Jacoby's one good eye took in the entire scene in a single, practiced glance. The exhausted horses, the woman, the desperate, haunted look on Silas's face. He knew this look. It was the look of the hunted. "Get them inside! Tala!" he bellowed. A Ute woman, her face as impassive and strong as the mountain itself, emerged from the door. She silently took Lorna from Silas, her small frame surprisingly strong, and guided her into the warmth. Amos pulled Silas in after them. The room was hot, smelling of furs, tobacco, coffee, and smoked meat. It was paradise. Silas, his voice cracking, told Amos everything. He told him about Lorna, about the escape, about the man. He told him the name, Luther Maddox. Amos, who had been listening silently, chewing on a piece of tobacco, went still. He walked to the heavy door, opened it a crack, and spat into the snow. He looked out at the pass. His one eye narrowed. "Maddox," he said, the name a curse. "I know the name. Poison. His men been trying to cheat my Ute friends out of their mining lands for a year. A snake." "Can we stay, Amos?" Silas asked, his voice breaking with exhaustion. "Just to rest. Just for a few days." Amos turned, his face a grim, carved mask. "You can rest," he said. "Tala will see to you, but you can't stay. You brought hell to my doorstep, Silas, and it's riding hard." Silas's blood, which had just begun to warm, ran cold again. "What do you mean?" "A rider came through yesterday," Amos said. "A bounty hunter said Maddox has put $500 on a woman's head. 500, alive or not. And he said Griggs, Maddox's dog, is on the trail. I know Griggs. He can track a shadow over bare rock. He knows this pass. He knows I'm here." Amos put a heavy hand on Silas's shoulder. "He'll be here, son, tomorrow. Maybe sooner. You got 2 choices, and only 2. He pointed up, toward the high peaks, now invisible in the swirling snow. "You can run farther, up into the high passes. The snow will likely kill you, but Maddox won't." "Or," Amos said, his hand dropping to the rifle leaning against the wall, "you stay, you turn, and you fight." The trading post was thick with the smell of smoked hides, coffee, and a sudden, suffocating silence. Amos Jacoby's words hung in the air, cold and heavy as a burial stone. Run farther or fight? Silas looked at Lorna. She was huddled by the great stone fireplace, Tala, Amos's Ute wife, silently pressing a steaming mug of broth into her hands. Lorna's hair was matted, her face gaunt, her eyes vast and dark, like two deep wells of exhaustion. The flight had taken nearly everything from her. He saw the faint, new swell of her belly beneath the oversized men's clothes. His child, or not. It was a life. It was her life, and running would not save it. Running meant the high passes. It meant more snow, more freezing nights, more hunger. It meant killing her, and the child. Slowly. It was a death of 1,000 small surrenders. And then what? If they survived, they would be ghosts. They would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, starting at every shadow, every strange horse. He would live, and his brother's murderer would win. Luther Maddox would have taken his ranch, his brother, and now his future. Silas Vane was not a man built for running. He was a man of the soil, of roots, of fences. He was a man who had already lost one brother to this fight. He would not lose himself. He turned back to Amos, the decision settling over him, hard and cold and absolute. How much ammunition can you spare, Amos? Amos Jacoby's one good eye studied him. He saw the shift, the hardening. He nodded, slowly. Enough. And I've got 2 repeaters, a Winchester and a Henry. That'll shoot straighter than prayer. We're not staying here, Silas said, his voice low, but carrying through the room. I won't bring his war to your door, old friend. You've given us shelter. That's more than most. Lorna looked up, the mug trembling in her hands. Silas, what do you mean? He walked to her, kneeling on the rough-hewn floorboards. He took the mug from her hands and set it aside. He took her frozen fingers in his. I've been running my whole life, Lorna, running from Jacob's ghost, running from the memory of that fire. Then I met you, and we've been running from Maddox. He looked into her eyes. I'm done running. We're going back. Back? Her voice was a terrified whisper. Back to the ranch? Silas, there's nothing. We'll be trapped. It's my land, he said, his voice a flat, iron thing. Jacob's land. If I'm to die, I'll die on my own soil, not in a snowdrift, hunted like a wolf. He squeezed her hands. We'll end this or die trying, but we'll end it. Lorna stared at him. She saw the man who had pulled her from the snow, the man who had held her in the way station, the man who had knelt beside her and claimed her, and the child, as his own. She saw the man, and he was terrified, but he was no longer afraid. She did not cry. She did not plead. The woman who had fled into the storm was gone. This woman, forged in fear and fire, simply nodded. All right, she whispered. We'll go home. Amos gave them everything he could. 2 fresh horses, strong mountain-bred Mustangs. That would not falter. The 2 rifles, the Henry and the Winchester, and over 200 rounds of ammunition. He gave them food, bacon, flour, beans, and coffee, enough for 2 weeks. He gave them dynamite, 4 sticks, with fuses. For the well, he said, his face grim. If they run you out, poison your own water. But his eye said, use it, be creative. They rode out under the cover of a moonless, star-choked night. They rode south, back down the pass, the way they had come. But the ride was different. The desperate, panicked flight had been replaced by a grim, focused resolve. They were no longer the hunted. They were the bait, returning to the trap, intending to set it themselves. It took them 4 days to ride back, moving only at night, sleeping cold in hidden arroyos during the day. Silas pushed them, but he was careful. He was tender with Lorna, watching her, making her rest, boiling water for broth every night, even when the small fire risked discovery. He was a man tending the most precious thing in the world. On the fourth night, they topped the rise, the same one he had crested in a panic just days before. He stopped his horse. Below them, in the pale, cold moonlight, lay the ruin of his life. The cabin was a dark, defiant square, but the barn was gone. It was a skeleton of charred timbers, a black, jagged wound on the land. The fences were a joke, a series of snapped posts and tangled wire, cut and pulled down. And everywhere, scattered across the home pasture, were the dark, still lumps of his cattle, his herd, slaughtered, left to rot as a message. Silas dismounted. He walked, his steps heavy, into the yard. The smell was the first thing that hit him, the smell of ash, cold and wet, and the sweet, sick smell of decay. Lorna dismounted behind him, her hand going to her mouth. "Oh, Silas," she breathed. "No." He walked to the burned-out barn. The stall where Clementine had slept was just a patch of ash. His tools, his forge, the saddle his father had given him, all gone. He knelt, scooping up a handful of gray ash, letting it run through his fingers. He felt a coldness inside him that had nothing to do with the night air. It was a rage so pure it was almost peaceful. He had nothing left to lose. "They burned it all," he said, his voice flat. He stood, wiping the ash on his trousers. "They burned the barn, but they didn't burn the house. They didn't burn the house." "Why?" Lorna asked, wrapping her arms around herself. "Because they knew we'd be back," he said. He looked at the cabin. "They left the trap. They left the killing floor." He turned to her, his face a hard mask in the moonlight. "Let's not disappoint them." For the next 3 days, they worked. They were not a man and a woman. They were a small, desperate army. Silas, with a grim, feverish energy, began to rebuild, not for living, but for fighting. He tore the remaining planks from the ruined barn and boarded up the 2 windows he had previously left uncovered. He left only a single, narrow firing slit in each of the 4 walls, just wide enough for a rifle barrel, cut at a man's height. The cabin was now a wooden box, dark as a tomb, lit only by the fireplace and a single lantern. He moved the heavy oaken table and wedged it against the front door. "They'll come in," he said, his voice echoing in the small, dark space. "But they'll come in slow." He overturned the heavy cast-iron stove, dragging it to block the rear window, creating a second point of defense. He took the 4 sticks of dynamite. He did not put them by the well. He buried 1 stick under the wooden porch, just to the left of the door. Attached to a long fuse he threaded through a crack in the cabin wall. He buried the 2nd stick near the empty, ruined water trough, a place where men and horses would gather. The 3rd and 4th he kept inside. Lorna worked beside him. She was no longer pale. Her face was smudged with soot, her hands raw. The morning sickness, which had plagued her on the ride, was forgotten, burned away by adrenaline. She was now visibly pregnant, her body changing, but she moved with a purpose that was terrifying. She loaded the rifles, the Winchester, the Henry, Silas's own shotgun, his pistol. Her hands were steady. Click-clack, click-clack. She lined the cartridges up on the rough-hewn mantelpiece. A row of brass teeth. She boiled water. She stacked firewood. She made coffee. She was the quartermaster of their tiny, 2-person war. On the 3rd afternoon, Silas stopped. He had done all he could. The cabin was a fortress. The yard was a trap. He stood by the 1 northern firing slit, staring out at the empty plains. "Lorna," he said, his voice quiet. She stopped stirring the pot of beans over the fire. "Yes?" "You should go." She did not turn. "Go where, Silas?" "To town, to Dry Creek. Get to the sheriff. His name is Barnes. He's not on Maddox's payroll. He's a weak man, but he's not a bad one. Tell him Maddox is here. Tell him there's a bounty. Tell him what's happened. He'll have to act. He'll have to send for a marshal." She turned, the wooden spoon in her hand. Her face was set. "And what will you do?" "I'll wait," he said. "I'll hold them off. I'll give you time." She walked to him. She stood beside him at the firing slit, her shoulder brushing his. She looked out at the empty, wind-swept land, the land that had cost him his brother and his livelihood. "Do you remember what I told you, in the shack?" she asked. "The night of the snow?" He did not look at her. "I remember." "I said I was yours. I meant it. You are not dying for me, Silas, and I am not running. I have run my whole life. I ran from my father. I ran from him." She touched her belly. "I ran from this, and then I ran from you at the canyon. I am so tired of running. This is my home. You are my home." She picked up the loaded Henry rifle from the table. "I don't know how to shoot, but I know how to load. You'll shoot, I'll load, and we will end this, or die trying." He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, the smudge of soot on her cheek, the stubborn set of her jaw. The terror that had lived in her for years was gone, replaced by a resolve that matched his own. She was beautiful. He had never seen anything so beautiful in his life. He did not argue. He just nodded and took the rifle from her. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "The Henry has a kick. You brace it, here, against your shoulder. You just point, and you pull." He spent the last hour of daylight teaching his pregnant, defiant wife how to kill. They came on the 4th day, just after dawn. The sky was a pale, flat gray, the air cold and still. It was Silas who saw them, a line of dark specks on the eastern horizon, resolving themselves into riders. "They're here," he said, his voice calm. Lorna, who had been asleep on their bedroll, was on her feet in an instant. Her heart hammered, but her hands were steady. She went to the hearth and poured 2 cups of a coffee, which was already hot. She handed one to Silas. "How many?" she asked, her voice just a whisper. 6, he said, his eye pressed to the slit. 6 riders. That's him, on the big bay. That's Maddox." They watched in silence as the riders approached. They did not come in fast. They came at a slow, arrogant walk. They fanned out in the yard, just out of easy rifle range. 5 hired guns, Griggs among them, his face a mask of cruel satisfaction. And in the center, Luther Maddox. He was not what Lorna had described. He was not a barroom brawler. He was handsome, dressed in a fine black coat, his hat clean, his boots polished. He looked like a senator or a judge. He looked civilized, and in his eyes, Silas saw a coldness that was worse than any barroom rage. "Silas Vane!" Luther's voice boomed across the yard, rich and confident. "A foolish place to make a stand, on your own graveyard." Silas said nothing. He stood by his firing slit, the Winchester heavy in his hands. "I am a reasonable man," Maddox shouted. "I have no quarrel with you. Rancher, you are a fly, and you have buzzed into my affairs, but I will let you live. Send me my wife. Send me what is mine." Lorna moved. She walked to the door, her steps measured. She pulled the heavy table back, just an inch, and lifted the bar. "Lorna, no," Silas hissed, grabbing for her. "He wants to see me," she said, her voice hard. "He wants what's his. Let him." She opened the door. The gray dawn light flooded the dark cabin. She stepped out onto the porch, her small, pregnant form silhouetted against the darkness behind her. She stood beside Silas, who had moved to stand in the doorway, his rifle held low, his body shielding half of hers. The yard went silent. The 5 gunmen stared. Griggs smiled. Luther Maddox's face changed. His confident smile faltered. He saw her. He saw her defiance. He saw her swollen belly, and his face contorted into a mask of pure, possessive rage. "You!" he spat. "You whore! You think you can hide behind this dirt farmer? You think you can steal my blood?" Lona said nothing. She just stared at him. "You are mine," he roared. "The child is mine. Get back here before I kill him and drag you home." Lorna raised her chin. She was trembling, a fine, high vibration, but her voice was clear. "I am not yours," she said, her voice carrying across the still morning air. "I was never yours." "That's enough," Silas said, his voice low. "Get inside." "Kill them!" Maddox screamed, his civilized mask gone. "Kill them both, but leave her alive, if you can. I want her to watch." The world exploded. Griggs and the other 4 men spurred their horses, fanning out, their pistols barking. A bullet splintered the doorframe where Lorna had been standing. Silas shoved her back inside, slamming the door, dropping the bar. "Get down!" he roared. He ran to the firing slit. The fight was brutal. It was dust and smoke and the screaming of horses. The hired guns were good. They used the ruins of the barn for cover, the dead cattle. Silas was better. He was not a gunfighter. He was a hunter. He was patient. He did not waste a shot. A man on a pinto rushed the house. Silas waited. He let him come. He fired the Winchester. The man was thrown from the saddle, his pistol spinning in the dust. "One." "Load!" Silas yelled, throwing the hot rifle to Lorna, grabbing the fresh Henry. She was already there, her hands working, ejecting the spent shell, sliding a new one in. Her face was pale, but her eyes were on fire. 2 men tried to circle to the back. "Silas, the back!" Lorna screamed. He ran to the rear slit. He saw them, dismounted, running low. He aimed at the lead man, the man who was running for the water trough. "Now!" he whispered. He fired, not at the man, but at the ground beside him. The bullet hit the buried dynamite. The explosion was deafening. It tore the earth open. The water trough disintegrated. The man was just gone. A red mist. The second man was thrown back, his body broken. 2, 3. "My God," Lorna breathed, her hands at her mouth. "Load," Silas said, his voice a rasp. Griggs and the last man were pinned down behind the barn. The fight stalled. It was a siege again. "They're waiting us out," Silas whispered, his eye at the slit. "Maddox is gone. I don't see him." "Silas," Lorna said, her voice tight with a new terror. "The porch!" He looked. The long, black fuse he had set was moving. It was being pulled, slowly, from outside. Maddox. He hadn't run. He had crawled, under the cover of the first volley, to the side of the house. He was trying to pull the fuse out, to save the dynamite for himself. "Get away from the wall!" Silas yelled. He grabbed the burning log from the fire. He touched it to the fuse, right where it entered the cabin. The fuse sparked. It hissed. It caught. It began to burn. Fast. A small, angry snake, disappearing into the wall. "Lorna, move!" He grabbed her, pulling her to the far side of the cabin, throwing her behind the overturned stove. A second later, the dynamite under the porch exploded. The front of the cabin imploded. The door was blown off its hinges, flying across the room. The table disintegrated. Dust, splinters, and smoke filled the air. And in the chaos, Luther Maddox stormed in. He was a nightmare. His fine coat was torn, his face black with soot, his hair wild. He held a pistol in his hand. He saw Silas, dazed, rising from the floor. He fired. Silas cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, and fell back, clutching his side. His rifle clattered to the floor. "Silas!" Lorna screamed. Maddox turned. He saw her, climbing out from behind the stove. His lips pulled back from his teeth in a triumphant snarl. "There you are," he breathed, advancing on her. The last gunman, Griggs, was yelling from outside, but he did not hear. "You," he said, were nothing until I made you mine." He stalked her as she backed against the far wall. "A pathetic, whimpering girl. I gave you a name, I gave you a home, and you gave it to him." He gestured, disgusted, at the bleeding man on the floor. "To dirt." He raised his pistol, leveling it at her belly. "My legacy, my blood. You think I will let you give it his name? I will kill it. I will kill you, and I will burn this place to the ground." Lorna was trapped. She looked at the man who had haunted her, the man who had broken her, and she felt nothing. The fear was gone. There was only a cold, hard rage that matched Silas's. She spit in his face, a full, defiant, contemptuous act. "I was never yours," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous thing. "And that is not your child." It was a lie, but it was the last bullet she had. It struck him harder than any physical blow. His face went white. The thought that she had been with another, that the child was not his. It broke his mind. He roared, a sound of pure, animalistic rage, and he raised his gun, not at her belly, but at her head. He never saw Silas. Silas had not been hit. The bullet had torn through his side, a raw, burning fire, but he was moving. He had crawled, his vision graying, his hand closing not on his rifle, but on his pistol, the one he had tucked in his belt. He saw Maddox raise the gun. He saw Lorna's defiant face. He did not have time to aim. He did not have time to think. He raised his pistol, both hands shaking, and he pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the small space. Luther Maddox froze. A small, dark hole appeared in the back of his fine black coat. He looked down, confused, as a red stain began to blossom on his white shirt. He turned, his eyes wide, looking for the source. He saw Silas, on the floor, pistol still raised. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He collapsed. He fell like a tree, heavy and final, his body hitting the plank floor with a sound that shook the small cabin. Silence. The dust began to settle. Outside, the shooting had stopped. Griggs, seeing his boss fall, had mounted his horse and fled, a streak of dust on the horizon. Lorna did not move. She stared at the body of her husband, a man who had been a god of terror in her life. Now just a body. Then she heard it, a small, wet cough. Silas. She ran to him. He was a heap against the wall, his face pale as ash, his hand pressed to his side. His hand was soaked, and the floor beneath him was dark and slick. He was bleeding out. "Silas," she sobbed bed, falling to her knees beside him. "Oh, God, no!" He looked at her. His eyes were hazy with pain, but they were his. He reached up, his hand shaking, and touched her face, his fingers smearing blood on her cheek. "You," he whispered, his voice a dry, cracked thing. "You're safe." "Don't!" she wept, pulling his hand to her lips. "Don't you dare! You're not leaving me! You're not!" He tried to smile. His eyes were open. He was breathing. He was alive. The first sound to pierce the ringing silence was the drip, a slow, steady, thick dripping from Silas's hand onto the dusty plank floor. Lorna stared at the dark, spreading puddle, her mind a frozen, blank thing. Then he groaned, a low, animal sound, and the spell broke. "No," she said, her voice a harsh, raw thing. She flew to him. "Silas, stay with me. Stay." She tore at her own dress, the one she'd been wearing for days, ripping a long strip of calico. She pressed it, hard, against the bleeding wound in his side. It was a terrible, wet, ragged hole. He cried out, his body arching in her arms. "I'm sorry," she wept, her tears dripping onto his face, mingling with his blood. "I'm sorry, but you are not leaving me. I will not let you." He was gray. His skin was the color of the ash from the fire. He was bleeding out, and they were miles from any help. She was alone, in a ruined cabin, with a dead man, a dying man, and a child in her womb. She did not panic. The woman who had been afraid of her own shadow was gone. Lorna Maddox was dead. This was Lorna Vane, or whatever she was now, and she was a she-wolf, and her mate was wounded. She ran, stumbling over Luther's body without a glance, to the fire. The kettle was still hot. She grabbed the whiskey bottle, the one Silas kept for snakebite, and a clean rag. She poured the raw liquor onto the wound. Silas screamed, a sound that tore her heart in two, but he was conscious. It was a good sign. She packed the wound. She bound him, tightly, with strips of cloth torn from her own clothes. From anything she could find. She dragged him, her muscles burning, away from the door, away from the cold, and laid him on their bedroll near the fire. She covered him with every blanket they owned. He drifted. For 3 days. He was a ghost, swimming in a gray, feverish fog. She did not sleep. She sat beside him, feeding the fire, forcing sips of broth and, later, water between his cracked lips. She changed his bandages. She cleaned the wound, which was angry and red. She willed him to live. On the 4th day, his fever broke. She had fallen asleep in her chair, a short, exhausted drop, and woke to the feeling of a hand on her hair. He was looking at her. His eyes were clear. "Lana," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. She wept, her head falling to his chest, careful of his side. "You're back," she just said, over and over. "You're back." His recovery was a slow, agonizing crawl. Weeks turned into a month. He was a creature of stubborn, raw-boned strength, but the bullet had taken much from him. He moved from the bedroll to the chair, his face gaunt, the lines of pain etched deep. Sheriff Barnes came. Finally, he rode in with Abe, who had returned to find a war zone and had ridden, terrified, for the law. Barnes was a weak man, as Silas had said, but he was not a fool. He stood in the yard, his hat in his hand, looking at the burned barn, the slaughtered cattle, the 3 fresh graves Silas had ordered Abe to dig on the far ridge. He came inside, his eyes wide, taking in the splintered door, the dynamite-scarred walls. He saw Luther Maddox's body, which they had wrapped in a sheet. "Dear God, Vane," the sheriff said, his voice shaky. Silas, sitting in his chair, a blanket over his knees, told him the story. He told it from the beginning. He told him about finding Lorna. He told him about the bounty. "Alive or not," he said, his voice quiet but hard. Lorna, her belly around, full globe under her dress, stepped forward. "He put that bounty on me. Sheriff," she said, her voice clear, "because I was carrying his child, and I ran." She told him about the note. She told him about the men. She told him about the final, brutal assault. Sheriff Barnes looked at the woman, her fierce, haunted eyes, the obvious pregnancy. He looked at the fortified cabin. He looked at Silas, a man who looked half dead but unbowed. He had seen the graves outside. He had heard the whispers in town about Griggs, about Maddox's temper. He went to Luther's body, pulled back the sheet, and saw the pistol still in his cold, dead hand. He let out a long, slow breath. "Self-defense," he ruled, his voice firming up. It was the easiest and the truest ruling he had ever made. A clear case of self-defense and defense of property. The legal battle was immediate. Luther Maddox, a man of such singular, vicious focus, had left no clear will. He had no heir but the one in Lorna's belly, an heir she would never let near his name, his land, his cattle, his vast, corrupt empire fell into limbo. Lawyers from Cheyenne, and even from back east, descended, tearing at the corpse of his estate. The threat of Luther Maddox was over, dissolved into 1,000 pages of legal paper. But the town was another matter. When Silas was strong enough, They rode into Dry Creek. He needed a doctor to see the wound, and they needed supplies they could not ask Abe to fetch. Silas, gaunt and leaning on a rough-hewn cane, lifted Lorna down from the wagon. She was 8 months pregnant, and she was beautiful, her face no longer haunted by fear, but filled with a quiet, fierce strength. The town stopped. The whispers were a wind, rushing down the single dusty street. "That's him, the rancher, Vane. Killed Maddox, shot him right in his own house. Well, Vane's house." And her, look, that's the widow Maddox. Widow, she was in the cabin with him. A woman in a bonnet, Mrs. Potter, saw them, sniffed loudly, and spat in the dust near Lorna's feet. "Shameful," she said, loud enough to be heard. Lorna flinched, her hand going to her belly. Before Silas could move, a man from the other side of the street, a rancher named Elias Thorne, who had lost grazing land to Maddox, stepped forward. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful. He turned to Silas. "Vane." He nodded, a sharp gesture of respect. The street was divided. Some saw a murderer and an adulteress. Others saw the two people who had done what the entire valley had been too afraid to do. They were outsiders. They were legends. And they were utterly, completely alone. The baby came in the dead of a bitter winter. A blizzard raged, a screaming white fury that reminded Silas of the day he had found her. It was just the two of them. The cabin was a fortress of warmth, the fire blazing, the wind howling. It was a long, hard night. Silas, his hands now scarred but steady, found he was not afraid. He had faced down Luther Maddox. He had rebuilt his home with his bare hands. He would not be beaten by this. He held Lorna. He boiled the water. He held her hands as she cried out, her strength a match for the storm outside. And in the gray, frozen light of dawn, as the wind finally died, she gave a final, tearing cry, and their child was born. It was a girl, small, perfect, with a shock of dark, wet hair. Lorna collapsed back, exhausted, sweat-soaked. Silas cleaned the child, his rough hands impossibly gentle. He wrapped her in a soft, clean blanket and stood, his heart aching, just looking at her. "Silas," Lorna whispered. He turned. He walked to the bed, his side aching from the long night, and he held out the small, warm bundle. She's beautiful. Lorna." He held this tiny, innocent thing, this child of his enemy, this child of the woman he loved. It was a life. It was a beginning. He held her like she was made of spun glass, like his rough, scarred hands might break her. Lorna watched him. She saw the fear, the awe, the tenderness in his face. She saw him wrestling with the ghosts. "She's yours now," Lorna whispered, her voice fierce with certainty. She reached out, her hand weak, and touched his. "She has no name but the one we give her. She has no blood but ours. She's yours, Silas, all yours." He looked from the baby's face to hers, and the last ghost in his heart, the shadow of Jacob, the shadow of Luther, finally, blessedly, dissolved. He bent, and he kissed Lorna. A long, deep kiss of salt and sweat and promises kept. Then he kissed the baby's forehead. He was a father. When the spring thaw came, they had a funeral. It was not for Maddox. It was for the barn. The char, the rot, the ash. It had all been buried under the snow. Now, it was an ugly, black scar. "We have to clear it," Silas said. They worked together, day after day. They piled the charred timbers. They sifted the ash. They found the melted remains of his tools, of his father's saddle. They did not speak. They just worked. The baby, who they had named Hope, slept in a cradle nearby, breathing the fresh spring air. When the ground was finally clear, scraped down to the bare, clean earth, Silas stood, his hands on his hips. Where the barn was, he said, that's where we'll bury the past. They took a single, unburned beam, and they carried it up the hill that overlooked the plains, the hill where Jacob had wanted to build a new house. They made it a cross. Not a religious one, but a marker. They stood there, the three of them. Silas, his arm around Lorna's waist. Lorna, holding hope. They were not burying Jacob or Luther. They were burying the grief. They were burying the fear. They were burying the scorn and the ghosts and the blood. They stood there for a long time, watching the wind move through the new spring grass. Then they walked back down, and Silas began to lay the foundations for a new, smaller barn. They rebuilt. It was not easy. It was a life of bitter winters and harsh, dry summers. They were poor. The herd was gone. They had 2 horses and a milk cow Abe had given them, but they were rebuilding. Silas, with Abe's help, raised the new barn. He mended the fences, his hands and Lorna's, working side by side, stretching the wire, tamping the posts. He bought 10 head of cattle, his face grim as he signed away the last of his savings. Lorna turned the cabin into a home. She planted a garden, her hands, once soft and pale, now brown and calloused. She coaxed green beans and tomatoes from the harsh, dry soil. She made the cabin bright. They were still outsiders. The town of Dry Creek never fully embraced them. The whispers followed them, a constant, low murmur. The rancher and the enemy's widow. They were a story, a legend, but they were not neighbors. They did not care. Their world was the fence line. Their world was the small, sturdy cabin, the sound of the wind, the cry of their daughter, their love, born in a blizzard, forged in a siege, had survived. It had survived the scorn. It had survived the ghosts. It had survived the grief. It was no longer a desperate, hungry fire. It was an ember. It was the hearth. It was a deep, quiet, unbreakable thing. One night, years later, the cabin was warm, the fire casting a low, gentle light. Hope, now a little girl of 3, was asleep in her small bed, her dark hair a tangle on the pillow. Silas sat at the table, a worn-out book in his hands, his face peaceful in the lamplight. The lines of pain were still there, but they were softer. They were just him. Lorna sat by the hearth, mending one of his shirts, the needle moving in a steady, easy rhythm. She looked at her daughter. She looked at her husband. Her heart was so full. It was an ache in her chest. She went to her daughter's bed and smoothed the hair from her forehead. The child stirred, her breathing soft and even. Lorna bent, her lips brushing the girl's ear, her voice a whisper, meant only for the child, and for the ghosts, and for the man she loved. He taught me what love was, she whispered, her hand resting on the child's head. He taught me that it wasn't pain, that it was this, it was quiet, and it was safe, and it was strong, and no one will ever take that from us again. Thank you for listening to this story. I truly appreciate you spending your time with Silas and Lorna. I'd love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment and let me know. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to From Wild West so you don't miss the next one. And finally, please share your thoughts on the story in English. I read every comment, and I'd love to know what you think.